The day my son told me I was too old to own my own home, I didn't argue. He placed papers in front of me and said, "Dad, this house is better off in my hands now." I looked at the signature line and felt something inside me go quiet. I signed without a fight. My son smiled like he had won. But 3 days later, a judge called his name in open court, a sheriff arrived at my old house, and one file on the judge's desk changed everything. My grandson already knew the truth, and when he finally spoke, my son stopped smiling. If you enjoy emotional family stories about betrayal, hidden secrets, and justice, subscribe to Behind Dad. And one quick note before we begin. The pictures shown in this video are creative visual dramatizations made to represent the story. They are not real photographs of the people or events. My name is Frank Miller. I'm 76 years old, and that house was more than 4 walls to me. I built most of it with my own hands. My wife, Susan, and I moved there when our son Daniel was only 6 years old. I remember carrying him through the unfinished rooms while Susan laughed and told me we'd never finish the place. 20 years later, we were still adding something new. That home held every birthday, every Christmas, every argument, and every beautiful memory our family had ever shared. After Susan passed away, the house became the one place where I still felt close to her. I kept her garden exactly the way she left it. Her favorite chair stayed beside the window. Some mornings I would sit there with coffee and talk to her photograph as if she were still listening. I knew the house was valuable, but to me, its real value could never be measured in dollars. Daniel began visiting more often after Susan's death. At first I was grateful. Then his visits changed. He started talking about taxes, repairs, and how difficult the house was for someone my age to manage. One afternoon he arrived with a folder and said, "Dad, you're getting too old for this place. Let me take care of everything." I told him I was still capable of making my own decisions. He smiled and said, "You're making this harder than it needs to be." Inside the folder was a transfer agreement. Daniel told me it would simply make managing the property easier. I trusted my son. I didn't read every page. I signed. The moment my pen left the paper, Daniel took the documents and hugged me. "You'll thank me someday," he said. That night I sat alone in Susan's chair and stared at the empty hallway. Something felt wrong, but I couldn't explain why. The next morning, Daniel arrived with movers. That's when I realized he wasn't planning to manage my house. He was taking it. I watched strangers carry boxes through the rooms Susan and I had built together. I didn't scream. I didn't call the police. I simply stood there holding her photograph. My grandson, Ethan, suddenly appeared at the doorway. He looked at the movers, then at his father, and whispered, "Dad." Grandpa never agreed to this. Daniel immediately told him to stay out of it. Ethan didn't move. He just looked at me with tears in his eyes. Then Daniel's phone rang. He answered, listened for a few seconds, and his face suddenly changed. The person on the other end said, "Your father has been summoned to court tomorrow." Daniel looked at me as if he had just seen a ghost. I still hadn't said a word. That night I sat in a small motel room with Susan's photograph beside me. I had no idea where I would sleep after watching strangers remove my belongings from the house I had built. I kept thinking about the papers Daniel had given me. The more I remembered, the more uncomfortable I became. I had trusted my son so completely that I never imagined he could use that trust against me. Around 9 that evening, someone knocked on my door. It was Ethan. He walked inside carrying a backpack and immediately hugged me. "Grandpa, I'm sorry," he whispered. I could feel him shaking. I asked what had happened, and he pulled out his phone. On the screen was a photograph of the document Daniel had asked me to sign. Ethan told me he had secretly taken the picture because the paperwork had made him suspicious. He had asked his school counselor to help him understand what it meant. The counselor contacted a legal aid office, and they discovered something Daniel had never mentioned. The document wasn't a simple management agreement. It transferred ownership of my home to Daniel. I stared at the photograph and felt my chest tighten. I couldn't believe my own son had done this. Ethan began crying and said, "Grandpa, I should have stopped him sooner." I pulled him close and told him none of this was his fault. But inside, I was broken. I kept wondering how many times Daniel had lied to me while pretending he was helping. The next morning, I went to court with Ethan beside me. Daniel was already there with an attorney. He looked confident until the judge entered the room. Judge Patricia Wilson reviewed the transfer papers carefully before asking Daniel why he believed the property should belong to him. Daniel said I had voluntarily given him the house because I was too old to manage it. The judge looked directly at me and asked whether I understood what I had signed. I admitted that I hadn't fully understood the document. I explained that Daniel had told me it was only for managing the property. The judge became silent for several seconds. Then she asked the clerk for the original file connected to my wife's estate. Daniel suddenly looked nervous. The clerk returned with a thick folder. Judge Wilson opened it and found a notarized document that Susan had filed years earlier. My wife's estate plan contained a protection clause stating that the house could never be transferred by another family member without my independent legal consent while I was alive. The judge looked at Daniel and asked why he had failed to mention this document. Daniel couldn't answer. Then Ethan stood up and asked if he could speak. His voice trembled as he told the judge that his father had pressured me into signing and had already ordered movers before telling me the truth. The courtroom became completely silent. Judge Wilson slowly closed the file and said, "Mr. Miller, your grandson has just provided information that may change the entire case. But before I make a ruling, I want the sheriff to review one additional document." Daniel's face turned pale. The sheriff walked toward the clerk's desk, opened the file, and pulled out a sealed envelope. The judge looked at me and said, "Mr. Miller, this was filed by your wife shortly before her death." I couldn't breathe. I knew Susan had left something behind. I just didn't know what it was. The courtroom became so quiet that I could hear the clock on the wall. The sheriff placed the sealed envelope in front of Judge Wilson. My wife's handwriting was clearly visible across the front. I stared at it, and for a moment I forgot everyone else was there. Susan had always been careful with important documents, but I had never seen this envelope before. Judge Wilson opened it slowly and began reading. Her expression changed almost immediately. She looked at Daniel, then back at the papers. "Mr. Miller," she said, "your wife anticipated that someone might attempt to take advantage of you after her death." My hands started trembling. The document was a sworn statement Susan had signed 6 months before she passed away. She explained that she had noticed Daniel becoming increasingly interested in the value of our property. She worried that he might eventually pressure me into giving up the house. Susan had instructed her attorney to place the document in the court file so it could be found if anything suspicious ever happened. But then Judge Wilson revealed something even more shocking. Susan had included a recorded video statement with the filing. The sheriff connected a small device to the courtroom monitor. Susan appeared on the screen. Seeing my wife again nearly destroyed me. She looked tired, but her eyes were clear. She spoke directly to the camera and said, "Frank, if you're seeing this, something has gone wrong. I want you to know that this house belongs to you for as long as you want it. No one should ever convince you that growing older means losing your right to choose your own future." I covered my face and cried. Then Susan said something that made Daniel lower his head. "If Daniel ever tries to take this home through pressure, deception, or manipulation, I want the court to protect Frank immediately. My son may be angry with me for saying this, but I would rather disappoint him than leave my husband unprotected." The video ended. For several seconds, nobody moved. Daniel finally stood up and said, "Mom didn't understand what she was saying." Judge Wilson immediately stopped him. "Mr. Miller, your mother understood exactly what she was saying." Then Ethan began crying. He looked at his father and said, "Dad, why did you do this? Grandpa trusted you." Daniel couldn't answer. The judge ruled that the property transfer was invalid and ordered the house returned to me immediately. She also referred the documents for further investigation because Daniel had misrepresented the agreement and attempted to remove me from my home. Then the sheriff placed the original property deed in my hands. I looked down at it and felt tears running down my face. But the judge wasn't finished. She turned toward Daniel and said, "There is one more document in this file. It concerns money that was removed from the property account shortly before this transfer." Daniel's entire body stiffened. I looked at him. For the first time, he wasn't angry. He was afraid. The judge opened the final document and quietly said, "Mr. Miller, I believe you deserve to know where your son's plan began." And when she read the first line, I realized the house had never been the real secret. The money was. The judge held the final document in her hands while everyone in the courtroom waited. My heart was pounding because I already knew Daniel had hidden something, but I wasn't prepared for what came next. Judge Wilson explained that months before asking me to sign the transfer, Daniel had secretly opened a line of credit against the property. He had used my house as security without telling me. I stared at my son. He looked down at the floor. The money had been used to cover debts from a failed business deal. Daniel had convinced himself that once he sold my house, everything would disappear. He wasn't trying to help me. He was trying to rescue himself. I felt something inside me break one final time. I had spent years believing Daniel was simply struggling. I would have helped him if he had asked. Instead, he chose to risk the home his mother and I had built together. The judge ordered the debt secured against my property to be removed and instructed the sheriff to ensure the house was returned to me. Daniel was also ordered to face further legal review for the financial actions he had taken without my permission. After the hearing, Ethan walked beside me toward the courthouse doors. He was still crying. I put my arm around him and said, "You did the right thing by telling the truth." He looked at me and whispered, "I was scared Dad would hate me." I shook my head. Never be afraid of the truth when the truth protects someone you love. When I returned home, the movers were gone. My furniture had been placed back inside. Susan's chair was exactly where it belonged. I walked into the living room, touched the armrest, and finally allowed myself to cry. I felt as though Susan had somehow protected me one more time. A week later, Daniel came to my door alone. He looked older than I had ever seen him. He apologized without making excuses. He admitted that he had been drowning in debt and became convinced that taking my house was the only way out. I listened quietly. I forgave him, but I told him something I will never forget. "Forgiveness doesn't mean I trust you with my life again. Trust has to be earned." He nodded. Months passed, and Daniel slowly began rebuilding our relationship. He helped repair the fence. He brought groceries. He visited Ethan and admitted his mistakes. I didn't pretend everything was normal because it wasn't. But I chose peace over hatred. Today, I still live in that house. Every morning I sit in Susan's chair with a cup of coffee and look at her photograph. I think about how easily I could have lost everything because I trusted the wrong person. If this story touched you, tell me in the comments what you would have done if your own child tried to take your home. Share this story with someone who needs to remember that growing older never means losing your right to dignity. And remember this lesson: never surrender your voice just because someone tells you you're too old to use it. Your age may change, your strength may fade, but your right to choose your own life never disappears. Thank you for listening to my story on Behind Dad. Sometimes the strongest revenge isn't destroying the person who hurt you. It's standing back up, protecting your peace, and letting the truth speak for itself.